MTN, Dangote Industries Limited and DStv are tops among African companies in the 2022 Brand Africa Top 100. This is according to the 12th edition of Brand Africa's annual Top 100. The 2022 survey was conducted between March and April 2022 and included over 80,000 brand mentions and over 3,500 unique brands. MTN was also named the highest-ranking telecoms brand on the continent. For more on this, we're joined by Thebe Ikalafeng, the founder of Brand Africa. Welcome and thanks for your time today. So can we establish, first of all, what the main purpose is of this annual ranking competition?
We started this 12 years ago with a simple goal, and the simple goal was to try and establish, to create a benchmark for us, at least a baseline, to see how African brands are performing relative to non-African brands in the continent. And it was really inspired by the fact that intuitively we felt that African brands were not being given a chance by Africans themselves, or they were not being competitive themselves. So we started then in 2010 to look at the relative admiration of African brands versus to non-African brands. And I think, as you know already, for the last 10, 12 years, on average, it's been 20% of the brands that Africans admire. Only 20% of the brands that Africans admire are African. And in a continent with such great potential, that's a bit worrying.
Absolutely. So we need to grow appreciation for African brands. But tell us how the determination is made of which brands rank among that top 100 and which lead that list.
The way we determine them is, and we start, when we started 12 years ago, it's so crazy. We only had 8 countries that we measured against to try and do a face-to-face survey. But in the last 7 years or so, starting in 2015, we partnered with which is called the largest database of Africans with mobile across the continent, to try and establish, using a mobile survey, to try and establish exactly Africans' admiration along four questions. The first question is, which brand do they admire overall? Second, which media brand do they admire? Third, which African brand do they admire? And fourth, which financial services brand do they admire? And this year we added an important question: which brands do they believe embody the African pride? And we go through all that list, and when that list is all done, which list is the number of brands that you talk about, over 80,000 brands that come up, and only about 3,000 of them unique or so. Then we sit with our partners, eNCA, and with eNCA then codes the information to ensure that the information is weighted correctly. Because if you recall, Nigeria's got 250 million people compared to a country like Botswana, perhaps with 1.5 billion people. So we want to make sure that you were able to compare apples with apples, so to speak. So that's literally how it starts. And then out of that, doing the weighting, then we code the information, then we create a ranking between eNCA and brand leadership.
Tell us a little bit more about some of those top-ranking African brands.
It's incredible, but Nike has been the #1 brand in the continent for 5 years in a row. And if you look at the top 10, in the highest ranking brand, as you said, to start with, is MTN, and MTN is a stalwart brand. And this year, MTN was tops on 2 areas. It was tops as a most admired African brand, but also when you ask the question, when the question is spontaneous, when you don't indicate to them a category or even a location. It's just that, which is the most admired African? What's the most admired brand? MTN came up tops among African brands. When you're being specific and say, what's your most admired African brand? MTN came tops out of that. And then when you ask the question, which brand embodies African values or culture, or which brand really gives you pride from an African perspective? Dangote tops that list. And when you ask the question, which is the most admired financial services brand? GT Bank out of Nigeria topped that list. And when you ask which is the most admired media brand, DStv tops that list. And it's interesting because DStv is not exactly a media brand, but it is a channel of channels, which among those is your channels, broadcasting from that platform. So those are really the top brands out of the continent. And as I've said, this year was a resurgence of African brands, with brands rising from the last 2 years was 13% of the top top 100, it's 17%. And there's a good reason for that. The reason is there's a lot of insular thinking now by countries, by continents, and especially as a result of COVID, where countries have to now be self-sufficient and look after themselves. And you're seeing a lot of a focus on African brands themselves trying to up the game. But what's more interesting for me this year out of the list is two South African brands, Drip and Batu, which was started in the last 2 years, made it all the way to the top 100. And it's very easy to explain. It's easy to explain because they own the value chain. They opened each about 20 stores during COVID. They spend massive amounts of millions on advertising and marketing in social and digital, and which really catapulted the brands to the highest rankings across the continent, because people say, but Drip is only available in South Africa and else and perhaps around the region, the sub-region. But so is Gucci. Gucci is number 7 on the list and has been in the top 10 for years. And you can only find Gucci in Johannesburg. But because admiration has got nothing to do with the fact that can they access it physically, it's got to do with what inspires them as a brand, the brand that they believe amidst their admiration status.
And in order to inspire that admiration, brands need to very cleverly craft their identity. So as from a business perspective, yes, all of those elements of owning your value chain, pumping money into marketing, physical access to product, those are very important. But when we talk about brand identity, give us some of the top things that you have been ideally placed to spot in terms of those top leading African brands that make consumers aspire to that.
It's quite simple. The brand has to be meaningful. It has to make a meaningful difference to the lives of consumers. If you look at a brand like an MTN, which is making telephony accessible, making the ability of the brand to be able to, for people to be able to transact. So it's about meaning, but it's also about identity. If you look at a brand like Dangote, it's the ability to be able to identify with not only the person Aliko Dangote, but also the idea that it's an African brand named after an African by an African, and that makes it easy to identify and to aspire. So an entrepreneur searching there or somebody buying the product can actually relate to that. So the most important criteria for me is meaning and love. That the brand has to be meaningful to the consumers. It must show a lot of brand love to the citizens to whom they sell. But also it has to make a difference to the surroundings or communities from which it comes. To me, that's the key things. The other stuff are easy. It's easy to come up with advertising because you can just have big pockets. It's easy to create a product. There's tons of products out there. It's easy to open a shop. There's tons of shop. What is not easy is to be meaningful. Is for a brand to make a meaningful difference in the lives of the consumers it serves and to contribute to the greater societal good. That's why brands have been asked now. The questions brands have been asked is not just so much, can I get it cheaper, faster, anywhere? The brands are asked is, what difference are you making in my life, in my community, in my country?